Great, thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Sahin for the invitation. Thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you to Dean Carter as well for hosting us, and especially yesterday. That I was running late and I made it barely to the beginning of the tour, and I thank you for sharing with us yesterday this knowledge. And when I look around, I can see Martin Luther King Jr.'s statue. You can see these pictures, the legacies, the stories that you told us about how the cultural, political networks, dimensions that go into building peace. And so what I want to offer today from my own particular academic standpoint, as someone who's a professor of Islamic studies but also a cultural anthropologist by training, what are some ways that I think we can go about this? And then I want to offer today a little bit of caution in how we go about this. The we being a US and in terms of a foreign policy, but also the we being everybody in this room and how we try to build peace. And so I offer this, thinking about our senior esteemed colleague earlier, with a sincere niyat, with a sincere intention towards talking about peace, although I may say a couple things that are a bit counterintuitive at first sight. So we just talked about social networks. Let's bring us to the world of Indonesia. Indonesia is often a country that doesn't get talked about when we talk about Islam, democracy, social media, but Islam is the world's largest, most populous Muslim majority nation. Just for a refresher course, 200 million Muslims in Indonesia, the same as all of the Middle East. They have been a semi-successful democracy since 1998. We can split hairs about the exact date, but since the fall of Suharto's authoritarian rule. And Islam and political, Islam plays an enigmatic role. There are Islamist political parties, but they don't fare very well at the ballot box. However, at the same time, the last 30 years has seen tremendous Islamization in terms of society, civil society, and the marketplace. So what I want to do today is talk about the reputation of Indonesia in the broader world. So post 9/11, and especially post-Arab Spring, people were looking for models. Secretary Albright, Secretary Clinton, President Obama are looking for models. Where's the model for a Muslim majority country? I think it's a natural question to ask, but it's also a dangerous one because there are not that many easy parallels. So allow me to begin. In his 2009 speech at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Indonesia's then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hassan Wirayuda, proclaimed Indonesia as the model of the possible coexistence of Islam, democracy, religious freedom, and women's rights. He said, and I'll quote just a short passage, "A few days ago in Cairo," remember this is 2009, right after Obama's speech in Cairo, "a few days in Cairo, President Obama invited the Muslim world to a partnership to address an array of critical issues: violent extremism, the Middle East situation, nuclear disarmament, democracy, religious freedom, women's rights, and economic development and opportunity. I am here today to tell you that Indonesia, the country with the world's largest Muslim population, has long prepared itself to answer President Obama's call for partnership." Now, this was right before they were about to sign a comprehensive partnership with the State Department and with President Obama. What I find interesting here is part of Hassan Wirayuda's policy of total diplomacy, diplomacy total, was to pioneer and market itself and promote itself as the home of moderate Islam. As you can see by my scare quotes, and I don't love scare quotes in general, but I think with the term moderate Islam, we have to have them there. And this talk is basically about why I think the term moderate Islam, we should do away with it. So here, if I can just point real quick to the first slide. On the left-hand side is the image of Islam that many of us see on the TV screens. This is Habib Razik, the head of the Islamic Defenders Front in Indonesia, who's ripping apart the first Playboy magazine that came into Indonesia, the Indonesian version. It fits the kind of stereotypical image of the angry Muslim, burning the flag, burning something. It fits that image. Now on the right is a picture of Kiai Haji Abdullah Gimnastiar, A'agim. A'agim is Indonesia's, indeed one of the world's most popular Muslim preachers. He, at his pinnacle of his popularity, had about 30% of the Indonesian viewing public watching his TV show. If you think about 200 million Muslims, that's a lot. Now, his whole strategy, and this is the cover of the book that will come out, but I show you because this is after one of his televised sermons during Ramadan. He's touching people's hands. They love him. He's really interested in branding himself as a preacher, but also rebranding Islam. When the Danish cartoons came out, I was sitting in a meeting as everybody was watching these cartoons and looking at them. He says, look, I can't make a statement on these unless I've seen them. So I'm watching this. watching this kind of heart-wrenching moment of all my friends looking at these cartoons, and he says, he had to make a public press conference. He says, look, we as Muslims cannot go out with the fist clenched saying Allahu Akbar and burning tires, the image on the left. We need to go out with love and compassion. So this was deeply felt and heartfelt, but it's also about turning a different image. Now that is a good image to have in one sense, but the term moderate Islam has a history. And as an anthropologist, I'm interested in post-colonial studies, and what I want to bring to this talk, especially after yesterday, towards the end, is a bit of a spin in terms of critical race theory, and how do we understand the construction of categories, and how does the creation of one category, moderate Islam, simultaneously construct its other, that of the supposedly radical Muslim. I think the problem of the term moderate Islam, we can see it in many different ways. It is also part of what I'm going to get to in the research side of this. It is also not just some term that the West and the US uses at its own will. It's a term that's reappropriated by people and Muslims and diplomats with their own agency, with their own interest in the game, both in democracy but also in keeping the US at bay to a certain degree. So here, this is kind of a political cartoon that I think signifies the burden of this term moderate Islam. We see it on the news all the time. Where are the moderate Muslims? Why won't they stand up? If you read the right newspapers and magazines, etc., you've seen them stand up. But this category still operates in our political reasoning. Where are these moderate Muslims? And it's often used against the very category and term. So in one sense, it puts a burden especially on American and supposedly moderate Muslims to defend Islam in very, I think, also reductionist terms. But then it's also become a strategy of foreign policy. Foreign policy advocates in the State Department and elsewhere meet with supposed experts like me and scholars and say, who are the moderate Muslims in that country? Here's a picture, a political cartoon of Obama in Syria. Hands up if you're one of the good guys. What is a good guy? What's a good Muslim? What's a bad Muslim? These are the questions that Mahmoud Mamdani in post-colonial theory has really addressed. And by creating the category of the good Muslim, he argues, we also create this category of the black Muslim. And so I offer this as just kind of a warning for how do we make peace if the inclusionary category of a good Muslim automatically excludes and reinscribes a stereotype against the supposedly bad Muslim. And what are the axes of philosophy, of reasoning, of the liberal, secular kind of post-enlightenment that we bring to this? So I want to challenge this a bit. The question that got phrased oftentimes, New York Times, foreign policy, etc., the diplomat blogs, is Indonesia the model of moderate Islam? Now the next line I have in quotes because I take it from historical sociologist Asef Bayat's book, Making Islam Democratic. And he says, look, this is the perverse, his answer to the question, is Islam compatible with democracy, this is the perverse charm of an irrelevant question. His answer is, of course it is. He looks at Iran and Egypt comparative over about 40 years. He says, of course it is. But it's only made so because people are mobilizing texts in a certain way. So here the anthropologist in me comes out. But it is also, Islam and Islamic texts and traditions can be mobilized, as we see it, to other ends. And so here in the picture is Dino Jalal, Dr. Dino Jalal, the former ambassador from Indonesia to the US, known as one of the best ambassadors they've ever had here, mobilizing a Middle East trip, the Interfaith Mission for Peace and Understanding, which I'll get to as a bookend in just a little bit. In this picture, though, he's gathered several of Indonesia's most famous religious figures. On the left is Bu Luluk. He's a very prominent Indonesian politician with the PKB, or kind of a classicalist, traditionalist party. And then Slamet Effendi Yusuf, who is one of the foremost leaders of NU, the largest Muslim organization in the world, Nahdlatul Ulama, and then Dino. And then they also got 12 interfaith leaders from the US and 12 from Indonesia to go to the Middle East for 2 weeks and to come back and report at the State Department, the White House, and Congress. Now let me give you a little sense about how I came into this research. So part of this is on that, just finishing this project on Indonesia's most famous televangelist, but part of his own inner circle, and here's some of his team. On the far upper left is Umar Hadi. Umar Hadi, at the time this picture was taken, was the director of public diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I got to know him because he was an advisor on Agim's moral movement, the movement to raise the conscience of the nation. Okay, thank you. But Umar Hadi also brought truckloads and busloads, I guess they're diplomats, they don't go by truck, busloads of foreign diplomats, academics, and journalists to Gim's Islamic school. It was an Islamic school, it was a corporate training seminar, and it was a TV studio. He would bring them there, I argued, to show them the world of a soft Islam, Islam lembut, or smiling Islam, Islam senyum, this idea of moderate Islam. The word in the translation for Islam or moderate Islam in Indonesian is Islam moderat. So it's not necessarily a native category, even though we can talk about it within Quranic terms. So here he is, supposed to be this image of the smiling Islam. Pro-business, he owns 20 companies. Pro-Western, he has a white anthropologist that they would bring up on the stage to show kind of, look, he has this white anthropologist here. He used to live with American missionaries, to try and show these axes of a soft, moderate Islam. Then after the Arab Spring, people were looking to Indonesia again. And to their credit, the Institute of Peace and Democracy forged 4 series of training seminars with Tunisian and Egyptian civil society leaders and religious leaders to talk about things like good governance. How do you get the military out of your power structures? How do you hold elections? What are the logistical things to registering voters? Not one panel talked about moderate Islam. It's how do you govern effectively? Tom Barfield has a wonderful chapter in a book on making religious politics. An Islamic state is a state run by good Muslims. It's not an ideology. So let's pull back from the categories is what I would suggest. Now the trip, the interfaith mission for peace in the Middle East, they went. 2 days in Indonesia, 1 week in the 10 days in the Middle East, and then they came back to Washington, D.C. One of their charges was to write a letter and a kind of a statement, a joint statement that everyone could agree on. As you can imagine, this is where soft power meets realpolitik. It's not easy to do this. In the final letter, there were quibbles between rabbis and imams, people talking about the language. Can we talk about the Palestinian state? 2 rabbis walked out, one of the Indonesian Muslim leaders walked out, and in the end, in the final letter, they talked about 2 peoples, not 2 states. So there are limits to this pursuit of a kind of moderate Islam that's only seen through the prism and the axes of a Western liberal secularism. Real quickly, I want to show a film, or I want to mention a film. This is the most famous film in Indonesia's history so far. For a long time, Titanic was the highest grossing Indonesian film. This is Verses of Love. It's about a young Indonesian man who studies in Cairo. He's getting his master's degree with the Sheikh at Al-Azhar. And part of the story in the early part is they're on a subway, and an American woman and her girl and her mom come on the subway. She has kind of cut off shirt here, tattoos, so she's supposed to be this kind of flashy American woman. And then an Egyptian man gets up and says, and someone gives her the mother her seat. She says, how can you give that seat to these kafirs, these infidels? Don't you know what they've done in Iraq? Don't you know what they've done in Afghanistan? And Fahri, the moral protagonist who's Indonesian, comes up and he says, hey, salawat Nabi dulu, do salawat Nabi, don't forget. This person, then using the Quran, using hadith, says, look, she has a right here, and your job as an ethical Muslim is to guarantee that safe passage and right, not to do this. Now what's interesting is throughout the film, the Arab men are presented as angry, those who cannot control their emotion, those who cannot control their nafs. And there's a dual story in Indonesia. Part of this is a feeling in the last 100 years of kind of inferiority, because now there's more housemaids than scholars in Mecca and in Medina. But 100 years ago, there were more Indonesian scholars than housemaids. So there's a sense of inferiority, but there's also a sense of superiority vis-a-vis Arab Muslims. And so within the Ummah, this idea of a moderate Islam can also be dangerous. And so they say, look, those are the kasar, those are the unrefined Muslims who don't really practice what is in the Quran. And so that film was shown to all of the ambassadors that were residing in Jakarta. It was a huge ceremony. The president of Indonesia spoke. Dino Jalal, who at that time was his spokesperson, spoke as well. And it was commemorating Indonesia and a kind of soft version of Islam. It was specifically presented as the antidote to that film Fitna. But I would also offer, and they didn't discuss this, that in that film itself, you have evidence of the kind of creation of an other within Islam, so that the category of moderate Islam also creates the category of a radical Islam. Now I show this cartoon to help make a point. I certainly do not, this is my final cartoon. I certainly don't subscribe to what's indicated, that moderate, I don't use this to say moderate Muslims and radical Muslims are the same. I use it to show how the very category of radical Islam was created through the category of moderate Islam, and that we have to move away from this language. Let me briefly put it in terms of race and critical race theory. I was thinking yesterday, as we were in the chapel, going through the rooms, what is this? As I'm looking at a statue, what's the connection? America's history with race, I would argue, infiltrates its dealings in terms of foreign policy with the current, as they refer to it as the Islam problem. How do we understand this? How do we get moderate Muslims? So I think race plays such an important destructive role in the way in which America's fabric has been founded, and even till today, of course, we see it in headlines. But I want to draw a parallel here, and a parallel to Morehouse. One of my good friends did his degree here, went on to get a MDiv at Princeton, did his degree here at Morehouse, got an MDiv at Princeton, and is about finished with his PhD. He tells a story about being on an airplane once with this cute as a button old lady. Could have been his grandmother, he says, but she was white. And they're talking and talking. She's hearing about everything he's studying and learning, from Socrates to Kant to Al-Ghazali to Ibn Athaillah. And she gets off the plane. She says, "This has been really nice. You are such an articulate black man. You're black, but you're articulate. You're Muslim, but you're moderate. You're a moderate Muslim. You're a good Muslim." And so in that very racist statement that she made, she's constructing both. To be articulate is to, at the same time, talk about a different category of blackness that is filled with a history of racism. And I just want to, as we think about how to build peace, what are the words we use? What is the powers and relations of power and history with those words? What has this word moderate Islam come to mean in America? We must understand its history of use, and also how do other countries use this? How do they use this to help build and foster dialogue, but also how might it also create other categories that are not as conducive to peace? So I just offer these thoughts as perhaps a way of gauging which directions we go with, and when we say, such as in the Obama thing, who are the good guys, that we think a little more harder about that. Are they good guys just like that woman on the plane who could only see that element of blackness through her prism of whiteness? Are we only the kind of foreign policy makers who can see Islam through the shades of a liberal, secular, post-Enlightenment West? I hope not, and I hope we can allow for greater freedom within Islam to have friends that are not just those who might be called moderate Islam. Thank you very much for your time.